In the far northern reaches of the Arctic Ocean, between Alaska and Siberia, lies Wrangel Island. For most of the year, it exists in a world dominated by ice, wind, and long periods of darkness. The island sits hundreds of miles from major settlements, separated from the rest of the world by frozen seas that can remain impassable for months at a time. Wrangel Island is large by Arctic standards, stretching across a rugged landscape of mountains, tundra, rivers, and coastal plains. During the short summer, patches of vegetation emerge from the frozen ground. Birds arrive and nest along the coast, and Arctic animals move across the island in search of food. But the warmer season is brief. Winter always returns. For much of the year, temperatures remain well below freezing. Storms sweep across the open Arctic. Sea ice forms around the coastline and extends far beyond the horizon. The sun disappears for long stretches, leaving only dim twilight during the darkest weeks of winter. Long before modern transportation connected distant regions of the world, places like Wrangel Island remained largely beyond human reach. Even in the early 20th century, reaching the island required careful planning, favorable weather, and a ship capable of navigating dangerous Arctic waters. To many people, the island represented one of the last remote frontiers on Earth. Few had lived there for extended periods. Fewer still had attempted to survive through multiple Arctic winters. In 1921, a small expedition arrived on Wrangel Island with ambitious plans. The group hoped to establish a permanent presence on the remote land. They carried supplies, equipment, and confidence in their preparations. What they could not fully predict was how completely the Arctic would separate them from the outside world. Over the next 2 years, the island would become the setting for one of the most remarkable survival stories in Arctic history. At its center was a young Inuit woman named Ada Blackjack, who had never expected to become known for endurance, isolation, or survival. When the expedition first stepped ashore, however, none of that had happened yet. The island remained quiet, distant, and unchanged beneath the Arctic sky. Ada Blackjack was born in 1898 in the settlement of Spruce Creek, Alaska. She was an Inupiat woman who grew up in a world shaped by Arctic conditions, subsistence living, and close-knit communities. Like many indigenous families in northern Alaska at the time, her early life was influenced by both traditional ways of life and the growing presence of missionaries, traders, and government institutions. As a child, Ada spent part of her education at a mission school. There she learned English and developed skills such as sewing, which would later become an important source of income. Her life, however, was far from easy. Economic opportunities were limited, and many families struggled to support themselves. By her early 20s, Ada faced serious financial difficulties. Her marriage had ended, and she was responsible for helping care for her young son, Bennett. The child suffered from health problems and required medical treatment that Ada could not easily afford. Finding stable work became increasingly important. At the same time, a very different story was unfolding far from Alaska. An explorer named Vilhjalmur Stefansson had become convinced that Wrangel Island could support a permanent settlement. Stefansson was already well known for his Arctic expeditions. He believed that people could survive in the far north by adapting to local conditions and making use of available wildlife. To test this idea, he organized an expedition to establish a small colony on Wrangel Island. The group chosen for the mission consisted of 4 young men. Alan Crawford, a Canadian and the expedition leader, was only 20 years old. Fred Maurer and Lorne Knight were Americans with previous Arctic experience. Milton Gow was a young American who hoped the expedition would provide adventure and opportunity. The plan was ambitious, but appeared straightforward. The team would travel to Wrangel Island, establish a camp, conduct scientific observations, and claim the island for Britain. Supply ships were expected to visit regularly, bringing additional provisions and maintaining contact with the outside world. One problem quickly emerged. The expedition wanted someone who could sew clothing, repair equipment, and assist with camp duties. Finding volunteers for such an isolated mission proved difficult. Many people understood the risks involved in spending years on a remote Arctic island. Ada initially showed little interest in joining. She had no background as an explorer. She was not seeking adventure. Her primary concern was earning money for her son's care. Eventually, she accepted the position. Historical accounts suggest that Ada was reassured by the presence of the 4 men and by expectations that the expedition would be regularly supplied. The journey was not presented as a desperate struggle for survival. It was described as a scientific and exploratory venture with logistical support. In September 1921, the expedition departed Alaska aboard a vessel carrying supplies, equipment, and several sled dogs. As the ship moved north through Arctic waters, the landscape gradually changed. Trees disappeared, temperatures dropped, ice became increasingly common. For the young explorers, the voyage represented the beginning of an important mission. For Ada, it was primarily a job. After reaching Wrangel Island, the group unloaded their supplies and established a camp near the northern coast. The ship then departed, leaving the 5 expedition members alone on the island. At first, there was little reason for alarm. The team possessed food, hunting equipment, shelter materials, and confidence in future resupply missions. They expected that ships would return. They expected that communication with the outside world would continue. What none of them knew was that the Arctic was about to disrupt those plans. The distance between Wrangel Island and civilization was immense, but the growing sea ice would soon make it feel even farther away. The expedition arrived on Wrangel Island in September 1921. The timing was significant. Summer in the Arctic was already ending, and winter conditions would soon begin to return. The group worked quickly, unloading supplies, organizing equipment, and preparing shelters before the sea ice closed around the island. At first, the camp functioned much as planned. The men established routines, surveyed parts of the surrounding area, and recorded observations. Hunting parties searched for game. Supplies were carefully stored. The expedition members understood that the coming winter would be difficult, but they believed it would be temporary. Their expectations rested on a simple assumption: a relief ship would arrive. According to the expedition's plan, outside support was essential. Food could be supplemented through hunting, but long-term success depended on periodic deliveries. Communication with the mainland also depended on ships being able to reach the island through Arctic waters. As autumn progressed, conditions became more challenging. The days grew shorter. Temperatures continued to fall. Strong winds swept across the tundra and coastline. Sea ice expanded farther from shore, gradually surrounding the island. Still, the expedition remained optimistic. The first winter passed without major disaster. Hunting provided additional food, and the camp remained operational. The group believed that when the ice retreated during the following summer, a supply vessel would appear on the horizon. But the summer of 1922 brought unexpected news. No ship arrived. Sea ice conditions in the region proved worse than anticipated. Efforts to reach Wrangel Island failed. Hundreds of miles away, decisions were being made and plans were changing. But the people on the island knew little about any of it. They simply waited. Weeks passed, then months. The absence of a relief ship transformed the situation completely. What had begun as a scientific expedition was becoming something else. Supplies that once seemed adequate now had to last much longer than intended. Every hunting trip became more important. Every item of food acquired greater value. For Ada Blackjack, the change was especially significant. She had joined the expedition, expecting a temporary assignment. She was not an explorer pursuing fame or discovery. Yet she now found herself on one of the most isolated islands in the Arctic, with no clear indication of when help would arrive. The realization spread slowly through the camp. The island was no longer a remote workplace. It had become a place from which departure might not be possible for a very long time. The Arctic had closed around them, and the distance separating them from the outside world suddenly felt much greater than the miles shown on any map. If you're enjoying this story so far, take a moment to subscribe. These long-form survival documentaries are based on real historical events, and there are many more remarkable stories still to explore. By the beginning of the second winter, uncertainty had become part of daily life. The expedition members could still work, hunt, and plan. What they could not do was leave. By the time the second Arctic winter approached, the expedition members understood that survival would depend less on planning and more on discipline. The island offered no shortcuts. Every day required work. Food had to be obtained. Equipment had to be maintained. Shelters had to withstand storms. Small problems could quickly become serious if left unattended. In an environment where temperatures remain below freezing for long periods, routine itself became a survival tool. The camp consisted of simple structures built to protect the group from the Arctic climate. Snowdrifts accumulated around the buildings during storms. Wind pushed against walls and roofs for hours at a time. Repairs were constant. Inside, space was limited. Fuel was valuable. Food was carefully rationed. Every item had a purpose. The men spent much of their time hunting. Wrangel Island supported populations of Arctic foxes, seals, birds, and at certain times, polar bears. Success depended on weather, timing, and patience. Some hunts produced valuable food. Others ended with little to show for days of effort. The expedition could not rely entirely on the supplies brought from Alaska. Fresh meat became increasingly important. For Ada Blackjack, daily responsibilities centered on keeping camp functioning. She prepared meals, repaired clothing, maintained equipment, and performed countless tasks that received little attention in expedition reports but were essential to survival. Sewing became particularly important. Arctic clothing suffered constant wear. Gloves tore. Boots deteriorated. Thick garments required frequent repairs. Exposure to severe cold could quickly become dangerous if clothing failed. Ada's skills helped keep the expedition operational. At first, she depended heavily on the experience of the others. Unlike some of the men, she had not joined the expedition as a hunter or explorer. But isolation has a way of changing expectations. As months passed, she began learning new skills. She observed hunting techniques. She learned more about managing equipment. In extreme cold, she adapted to routines that would have seemed unfamiliar before arriving on the island. The Arctic offered little room for specialization. Everyone needed to contribute. As the seasons changed, daily life settled into a pattern. Morning tasks were followed by hunting trips, repairs, observations, and preparation for the next day. Weather dictated schedules more than any clock. During storms, activities often became limited to whatever could be accomplished inside the shelter. When conditions improved, work resumed immediately. The psychological challenge of isolation also grew more noticeable. The island offered vast open spaces, but very little variety. The same coastline, the same snow-covered terrain, the same horizon, day after day, month after month. In such environments, routine serves another purpose beyond physical survival. It preserves structure. The expedition members maintained records, observations, and schedules. These activities provided a sense of continuity and purpose. Time could otherwise become difficult to measure. Seasons blended together. Weeks passed with little external change. The return of sunlight after the dark winter months brought temporary relief. Wildlife became more active. Hunting opportunities improved. Yet the larger problem remained unchanged. No supply ship appeared. The group continued to wait. As supplies diminished, the importance of successful hunting increased. The island still provided resources, but obtaining them required effort and sometimes risk. Long journeys across snow and ice became necessary. Despite the challenges, the camp survived. For a time, cooperation helped compensate for uncertainty. The men shared responsibilities. Ada continued her work. Together, they maintained a fragile balance between available resources and daily needs. But as the months passed, concerns about rescue became increasingly difficult to ignore. The second summer had come and gone. Still no ship, still no contact, still no reliable indication that anyone would arrive. The realization forced the expedition to consider options that had once seemed unnecessary. If help could not reach Wrangel Island, perhaps someone from the island would have to reach help. It was a decision that would change the course of the entire expedition, and it would eventually leave Ada Blackjack facing the Arctic alone. By late 1922, the expedition was no longer simply waiting for rescue. It was beginning to run out of time. By January 1923, the expedition faced a decision that carried enormous risk. No relief ship had reached Wrangel Island. Supplies were becoming increasingly limited, and there was still no indication that outside assistance was on the way. The four men understood that waiting indefinitely might eventually become impossible. A plan was made. Alan Crawford, Fred Maurer, and Milton Gow would attempt to cross the sea ice toward Siberia and seek help. The journey would cover hundreds of miles across one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Success was uncertain, but remaining on the island seemed equally dangerous. One man could not make the trip. Lorne Knight was suffering from severe illness, believed to be scurvy. Months of limited nutrition had weakened him considerably. He was no longer capable of undertaking a long Arctic journey. As a result, Ada Blackjack remained behind to care for him. On January 29, 1923, the three healthy men departed the island with a sled and supplies. They disappeared into the frozen distance and were never seen again. Their fate remains uncertain, though historians believe they likely perished somewhere on the sea ice between Wrangel Island and Siberia. After their departure, the camp became almost silent. Only 2 people remained. One was seriously ill. The other had never expected to be responsible for the survival of an Arctic expedition. The burden now fell largely on Ada. Lorne Knight's condition continued to deteriorate. He required care, food, and constant attention. At the same time, the daily demands of survival did not disappear. Firewood had to be collected. Shelter needed maintenance. Food had to be obtained. There was no one else to do these things. Ada gradually assumed responsibilities she had once avoided. Earlier in the expedition, she had often been uncomfortable handling firearms. Hunting had been performed mostly by the men. Now necessity forced her to learn. She practiced with a rifle. She hunted foxes and other available game. She set traps. She gathered whatever resources she could find. The learning process occurred under pressure. Failure would not simply mean hunger. It could mean death for both herself and Knight. The Arctic offered no forgiveness for mistakes. Storms continued to move across the island. Temperatures remained brutally cold. Some days, leaving the shelter required fighting through powerful winds and deep snow. Yet Ada continued. She kept records in a diary. She monitored supplies. She maintained the camp as best she could. At times, her only regular companion was the expedition's cat, Vic. The animal moved through the small shelter, while months passed without any sign of another human being. Outside, the island remained unchanged. The same frozen coastline, the same empty horizon, the same endless Arctic silence. But inside the camp, the situation was becoming increasingly fragile. Lorne Knight's health was failing, and soon Ada Blackjack would find herself completely alone. As the winter of 1923 continued, the situation at the camp became increasingly difficult. Lorne Knight's illness showed little sign of improvement. Historical records indicate that he was suffering from severe scurvy, a disease caused by a prolonged lack of vitamin C. In remote Arctic expeditions, scurvy had been a recurring threat for centuries. Weakness, pain, swelling, and exhaustion often followed. By this stage, Knight was largely confined to the shelter. Ada Blackjack became his caretaker. She prepared food, brought water, maintained the stove, and tried to keep the camp functioning. Every task required effort. There were no replacements, no relief crews, and no nearby settlements from which assistance could come. The isolation was now complete. Months had passed since the departure of Crawford, Maurer, and Gow. No message arrived. No rescue ship appeared. No tracks crossed the snow outside the camp. Only silence. Ada's responsibilities continued to grow. Each hunting trip carried risk. If she became injured, there would be no one available to help. If she failed to find food, both she and Knight would suffer the consequences. Despite these pressures, she continued to hunt. She trapped Arctic foxes. She shot birds when opportunities appeared. She gathered fuel whenever conditions allowed. Her diary entries reveal a practical focus on daily survival. The records do not present dramatic speeches or heroic declarations. Instead, they describe ordinary tasks performed under extraordinary circumstances. This may be one of the most remarkable aspects of the story. Survival often appears dramatic when viewed from a distance. Yet for the person living through it, survival is usually repetitive. It consists of hundreds of small decisions made one day at a time. On June 23, 1923, after months of illness, Lorne Knight died. Ada was now the only surviving member on Wrangel Island. The 3 men who had left seeking help never returned. Night was gone. The camp that had once housed 5 people now contained a single resident. At 24 years old, Ada Blackjack found herself entirely alone in one of the most remote places on Earth. The psychological weight of such isolation is difficult to measure. There were no conversations, no visitors, no certainty that rescue would ever come. Even the passing of time became difficult to judge. Days blended together. Weeks disappeared into routine. The Arctic landscape changed slowly, offering few reminders of the calendar. Yet Ada continued to maintain structure. She kept writing in her diary. She continued hunting. She repaired equipment. She monitored supplies. She cared for herself in the same disciplined manner she had used while caring for Night. This persistence proved essential. Many survival situations are not defeated by a single disaster. Instead, they are won or lost through consistency. A missed task, a neglect to repair, or a failure to prepare can gradually create larger problems. Ada avoided those mistakes. Throughout the summer of 1923, she remained alert for signs of approaching ships. The sea ice slowly retreated from parts of the coastline. Open water became visible once again, but uncertainty remained. The expedition had already spent nearly 2 years on Wrangel Island. The previous summer had passed without rescue. There was no guarantee this one would be different. For Ada, each day began much like the one before. She woke in a camp occupied by no one else. She performed the tasks necessary for survival. Then she waited, and somewhere beyond the horizon, unknown to her, a ship was finally making its way toward Wrangel Island. During the summer of 1923, conditions in the Arctic gradually became more favorable for navigation. Sea ice that had blocked access to Wrangel Island for months began to break apart. Open channels appeared across parts of the Arctic Ocean. For the first time in a long while, reaching the island became possible. A rescue effort was finally underway. The vessel sent to investigate the fate of the expedition approached Wrangel Island in August 1923. Nearly 2 years had passed since Ada Blackjack and the others had first stepped ashore. No one aboard the ship knew exactly what they would find. The expedition had been silent for a long time. The possibility that no survivors remained was very real. As the vessel neared the coastline, members of the rescue party began searching for signs of human activity. Smoke, movement, tracks, anything that might indicate life. Then they saw evidence that someone was still there. Ada Blackjack had survived. When rescuers reached the camp on August 20th, 1923, they found her alive and in surprisingly stable condition considering the circumstances. She had spent months alone after Knight's death, maintaining the shelter, hunting for food, and preserving enough structure in her daily life to endure the isolation. The camp itself reflected the reality of those months. Supplies were limited. Equipment showed signs of heavy use. Everything suggested a prolonged struggle against both the environment and solitude. Ada's survival was not the result of a dramatic final rescue or a last-minute escape. It had been achieved through persistence. Day after day, she had continued performing the small tasks required to stay alive. The rescuers also recovered the expedition's records, including diaries and notes that documented what had happened on the island. These records helped reconstruct the story of the expedition and the fate of those involved. Soon afterward, Ada boarded the rescue vessel and left Wrangel Island behind. The island itself remained unchanged. The same mountains overlooked the coastline. The same winds crossed the tundra. The same Arctic silence continued after the camp was abandoned. For Ada Blackjack, however, one of the longest chapters of her life had finally come to an end. When Ada Blackjack returned from Wrangel Island, much of the public attention focused on the expedition itself. Questions were asked about the missing men. Reports examined the decisions that had led to the venture. Newspapers discussed the failure of the colony and the hardships faced by those involved. Yet over time, another part of the story became increasingly significant. Ada Blackjack had survived conditions that many experienced explorers had not. She had not joined the expedition as a celebrated adventurer. She was not a trained expedition leader. She had accepted the position largely because she needed work to support her son. What followed transformed her place in Arctic history. For months, she maintained a remote camp, cared for a seriously ill companion, learned skills that circumstances demanded, and endured complete isolation after his death. Her survival was not built on extraordinary equipment or dramatic rescues. It depended on routine, adaptability, and persistence. The story also serves as a reminder of how survival is often remembered. Famous expeditions frequently focus on leaders, explorers, and ambitious goals. Yet history sometimes reveals that endurance comes from unexpected individuals whose contributions were overlooked at the time. Today, Ada Blackjack is recognized as one of the most remarkable survivors in the history of Arctic exploration. Wrangel Island remains a distant place on the map, surrounded by the same cold seas that challenged the expedition more than a century ago. The camp is gone. The people involved are long gone. But the record remains. A young woman arrived on a remote Arctic island as a hired seamstress. 20 months later, she was the only one left alive. And in the silence of the Arctic, that fact speaks for itself.